Resuming debate, the honourable member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm here today in the House to address C-45, the Cannabis Act, and the amendment that I have brought, which has been grouped together with the members from Saanich Gulf Islands amendment. Now, I would have preferred to delete the whole bill because this is a seriously flawed piece of legislation. But, you know, in addition to deleting the section that I'm going to talk about today, which is the section on home grow, I would just point out that the government is rushing ahead with this legislation. There are 243 days left before they're going to arbitrarily legalize marijuana, even though the provinces and the municipalities and the police have said that they won't be ready. You know, there are numerous provinces and territories that have not even come out with the plan of how they're going to implement it. And this legislation is not yet through the House. It has not yet gone to the Senate. There has been no public awareness and education campaign launched, and so I would just encourage the government, again, not to rush forward with an arbitrary date. There are very serious implications to this bill. One of the many flaws in this bill is on the subject of home grow. I'm going to read to you from the bill what the intent of the bill was and then show how this doesn't align. So the bill says that its goal is to protect the health of young persons by restricting their access to cannabis, to provide for a reduction in illicit activities in relation to cannabis, to deter illicit activities, to reduce the burden on the criminal justice system with relation to cannabis, and to provide access to a quality-controlled supply of cannabis, and to enhance public awareness of the health risks associated with cannabis. So in this legislation, the government is allowing the growth of 4 plants. Now, we heard testimony at Health Committee that said 4 plants, and this was when there was actually a height restriction of 100 centimeters on those 4 plants, which has since been removed. Those 4 plants at 100 centimeters could produce up to 600 grams of marijuana. 600 grams of marijuana in a house with no provision for storage and lockup. I'm not sure how the 600 grams of marijuana actually even lines up to the possession maximum of 30 grams, but you know, even failing that, this is not keeping marijuana out of the hands of our children. Absolutely, it is not. And in addition, we heard testimony from Colorado and Washington states who had legalized marijuana. Now, Colorado allowed home grow, and Washington state did not allow home grow, except in the case of those medical marijuana users that were too fragile to get to a dispensary. So what they found was that in Colorado, where they allowed home grow, that organized crime got involved and was, you know, a huge factor in the home grow. Now, obviously, if the bill is supposed to be keeping it out of the hands of children and keeping organized crime out of it, home grow is not the way to go about it. Washington state actually saw, by not allowing home grow, that children and young people in Washington state are having difficulty getting their hands on marijuana, and that the organized crime portion of the marijuana trade has been reduced to less than 20% in less than 3 years. And so in terms of outcomes of keeping it out of the hands of children and keeping organized crime out of the situation, you can see then that removing home grow is absolutely essential. Now, one of the testimonies that we heard was from the folks that grow medical marijuana. And in this process, this is a very regulated process that traces all of the production, all of the distribution, who it goes to, and there is rigorous quality control testing. There is testing to ensure that there is no mold, to look at the potency, and numerous other factors with respect to cannabis. Now, you can see one of the goals in this bill is to provide access to a quality-controlled supply of cannabis. And so medical marijuana, as it's regulated today, meets that. But let's talk about that criteria with respect to home grow. There is absolutely no quality control testing in home grow. And in fact, there are serious issues related to mold, related to ventilation. And we heard testimony as well that home grow type operations experience 24 times more likely to have a fire. So there's hazards associated with this. I had the Real Estate Association come and visit me in my office and talk to me about what's required for them today when they sell a house that's had marijuana grow up inside of it. They have to do a certification to make sure there isn't any mold and to address any of the issues that may have arisen. And so their question was, well, what will be required when this bill passes? Will we have to do that on every house where somebody has grown marijuana? And of course, those answers don't exist because this flawed legislation isn't well thought out and nobody has the implementation plan that will occur at the provincial and municipal detailed levels. And of course, with 243 days left to go, you would think that those answers and that information would be well in hand, but it is not. And so there are these issues that continue to not be addressed by the government by having home grow in the bill. Now, with respect to the honourable member from Saanich Gulf Island and her amendment, which is talking about all of the extra criminal charges that exist in this bill. There was, for example, if you have 4 plants, you are well within the law. But if you have 5, then you're a criminal. If you possess 30 grams, you're okay. If you have 31, you're a criminal. She talked about some of the sentences of up to 14 years, which are not in alignment with other judgments on possession of other alcohol and drugs, which are more like 2 to 3 years. So there's a huge number of issues with respect to that criminality, but all of those different charges will continue to plug up the courts, which was one of the things this bill was supposed to do, was say, let's offload the courts because we've got murderers, rapists, and all kinds of court cases being dismissed because the Minister of Justice hasn't appointed enough judges. And the courts are clogged up with these rather minor possession-type charges. So again, this legislation is not meeting its goal in any way, but especially within the home grow area. Now, I'm really disturbed that the government thought it was going to improve the legislation by removing the height requirement on the home grow plants. So originally it was a maximum of 100 centimeters, and if you got to 150 centimeters, then of course that was another criminal charge. They took that away, and it's really disturbing because right now there are videos out on YouTube that will show you how you can grow your marijuana plant with chicken wire so that you can stretch it out and move it around. We saw pictures from the folks that came and testified at committee of trees. So if 4 plants of 100 centimeter size could bring 600 grams of marijuana, then how much more could we get if we grew 4 trees of marijuana? And there's no specification now in the bill to restrict that amount. And the member from Saanich Gulf Island is quite correct when she says that there are issues with trying to have people breaking in, for example. There's a lot of evidence of that from Colorado, where organized crime would break in and raid various grow-ops. Now, the police have testified that they are unable to police this home grow section. They can't see into people's houses. They believe that they will receive a lot of nuisance calls. Joe, the neighbor, says his neighbor has 5 plants, not 4 plants. There's a smell, there's a mold problem. All of these kinds of things will put a lot of burden on the police force. And so they did not feel that this should be part of the bill. The testimony that they provided was that it was not enforceable and they did not have the resources. And so for the numerous reasons that I've stated, this home grow section of the bill that I'd like to see deleted doesn't protect the children. It does not keep marijuana out of the hands of children. I would argue it makes it easier to access for children. It certainly doesn't keep organized crime out, as we saw in Colorado. It certainly doesn't provide access to a quality-controlled supply of cannabis, which we see with the medical marijuana business, but not in home grow. And there was no public awareness done, and the time is ticking away, both on my speech and in the 243 days that remain before the arbitrary legalization with this flawed bill by this government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Scarborough South.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member from Sarnia for her speech and for her actions and activities on our committee, for which she is a very well-contributing member. I just wanted to ask the member, under this bill, Bill C-45, the Act creates an offence under the criminal law for the cultivation of more than 4 plants. It also creates an offence for the distribution of any portion of that. It's only for personal cultivation, and any attempt to commercialize that, to sell any of that or to distribute any of that to other persons would result in a criminal charge. So those controls are in place. The law also allows for provinces, territories, and municipalities to implement such regulations as they deem appropriate for their jurisdiction and for their circumstances, which may be necessary to exercise control on the circumstances under which those plants may be grown, to place additional limits on the number of plants, to put in regulations and requirements with respect to safety, security, sanitation, air quality, its access to children. There is also provision within provincial regulation for restrictions on where that can take place, whether it can take place, for example, in multi-use dwellings such as apartment buildings or condo buildings. And so given that the criminal law addresses an offence for creating more plants and also contains provisions to prevent people from selling what is being produced, and the appropriate level of legal jurisdiction for other restrictions and controls is at the provincial, territorial, or municipal level. I'm wondering if the member might feel that that level of control could be appropriately exercised to address the concerns that she has raised in her speech.
The honourable member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank you to the member opposite for the question. There was a lot in that question, so I'll try to address all the points. First of all, in the discussion about landlords of apartment buildings, etc., one point that ought to be raised has to do with homeowners in Ontario and Quebec. Today, with the existing laws, if you own a home and you rent out part of your home or your whole home to somebody else, under the provisions of this bill, you would not have the right to prevent them from growing marijuana or consuming marijuana in the house. And I think that would be a concern to many, many people that are homeowners. In terms of the criminality that is in the bill, we know that organized crime has a $9 billion industry going in Canada. And it's a typical naivete of this government to put laws in place when it's clear that organized crime people are not going to obey the laws. They're going to do what they did in Colorado, and they're going to have grow-ops, and they're going to have multiple grow-ops, and they're going to break into grow-ops, and that's the way that's going to go. And so I would say, with respect to the provinces and municipalities being able to put their own extra criteria in place, it's a total abdication of leadership on the part of the Liberal government. This was their campaign promise. This was their promise to the Canadians, and they've totally not nailed down the details of anything of how this should be done standardly across the country in order to protect our children and to protect our roads. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for. My apologies. Vancouver Kingsway, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable colleague just touched on an issue that I think was a major focus of this bill, which actually emanates in Section 7 of the bill, which sets out the purposes of the legislation, one of which is to transfer the production and distribution of cannabis from the illegal world and bring it into the legal, regulated world. And my honourable colleague, commented on her concerns of organized crime still being involved in this industry. My question has to do with edibles and concentrates. This legislation, once passed, will still leave illegal edibles, concentrates, and other non-smokable forms of cannabis. Leaving aside the health issues, those products will be left to the black market, to organized crime, who won't be distributing cannabis products in child-proof packages, let me assure you. So I'm wondering if my honourable colleague has any comments on the wisdom of the Liberal government leaving those products to the illicit market when one of the purposes of the bill is actually to stop the illegal black market production of cannabis products.
Honourable member for Sarnia-Lambton in
Well, thank you,
45
Mr.
seconds
Speaker.
or less, please.
All right, and I thank the member from Vancouver Kingsway for the question. Certainly, if the purpose of the bill, as stated, is to get organized crime out of the picture, then it should be noted that if you look at all the jurisdictions where marijuana has been legalized, and you look at the one that had the best outcome with respect to getting organized crime out of that, it would be Washington State. And again, they took a medical marijuana, very regulated system that had state dispensaries that included edible products, because then they could control the amount of marijuana that's in the edible products, as opposed to home grow, where you could bake your brownies, but what are you sure of in terms of how well distributed the marijuana is through your brownies, and what if your children eat those? So there's a lot of hazards that weren't addressed by this government, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate, the Honourable